The heroes and legends of the Iliad and the Odyssey inspired many great individuals throughout the ancient world, and these people played a great role in influencing history. Pyrrhus of Epirus was no exception. His adventures and conquests around Greece, Italy and Sicily during the early Hellenistic age gained him a reputation for martial prowess which was unmatched in history, and his benevolence to his people and soldiers ensured that he would be remembered fondly by his adversaries and friends alike, while his rashness would make him a lesson for others. In the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, his empire fragmented and was fought over by his generals. His mother, Olympias, whose grandson now sat on the throne of Macedon, was threatened by the son of Antipater, Cassander. Olympias, being a Molossian herself, allied herself with King Aeacides of Epirus and marched with him to reconquer Macedon. However, by 317 BC, she had lost popular support due to her ruthlessness, and Cassander now decided to take advantage. He pushed north and invaded Macedon, gaining victory and having Olympias killed. In this triumph, a part of the Epirot army had rebelled against Aeacides and ousted him, declaring Neoptolemus II as king instead. Many of the deposed king's allies and family were killed, but his son, the 3-year-old Prince Pyrrhus, was spirited away towards Megara on the eastern border of Epirus. His family had sympathizers in the town, but he was not safe from Cassander. Because of this, the prince's guardians fled north into Illyria, where they took refuge in the court of Glaucias, king of the Illyrians, who pitied the young prince and took him in. He also possibly did this for several practical reasons, either because he decided a claimant to the Epirot throne was more valuable to him than Cassander's possibly empty promises, or because his wife was also a Molossian and convinced him to spare her kin. Not long after, Cassander invaded Illyria and defeated Pyrrhus's guardian in battle. He pledged to do no harm to the allies of Cassander in the region, but retained Pyrrhus at his court. In southern Greece, the forces of Antigonus I and Cassander were battling, which weakened the Macedonian king's control. The deposed Aeacides decided to take advantage of this weakness and marched back into Epirus, where he quickly gathered a large army. Cassander sent his brother Philip to deal with him, who quickly won 2 battles against and killed the Epirot king. Pyrrhus's father was dead, and the usurper Neoptolemus was back on the throne. After another round of fighting in Epirus and a peace between the Diadochi, Glaucias invaded Epirus in 307 BC, drove out Neoptolemus, and installed the 11-year-old Pyrrhus as king, whose kingdom was now essentially a client of the Illyrians. 6 years later, Pyrrhus travelled north to attend the wedding of Glaucias' son, but the Molossians once again revolted and overthrew Pyrrhus. Disgusted at his dependence on the Illyrians, they once again summoned Neoptolemus and placed him on the throne. This time Glaucias could not help Pyrrhus, and he instead withdrew to southern Greece and the court of Demetrius Poliorcetes, son of Antigonus I, who had married Pyrrhus's sister Didomea. He then travelled with his new companion to Asia, where they rendezvoused with Antigonus. Under these 2 kings, Pyrrhus learned much in terms of generalship and siege warfare. Antigonus supposedly acknowledged his talents, stating that Pyrrhus would be the greatest general of his time if he lived long enough. This assertion would soon be tested for the first time. In 301 BC, the 80,000-strong forces of Lysimachus and Seleucus faced off against the 80,000-strong army of Antigonus and Demetrius at the Battle of Ipsus. At the age of 18, this was Pyrrhus's first experience of a major battle, and he would prove to be a competent fighter. As a young aristocrat, he likely fought in the cavalry alongside his brother-in-law Demetrius on the right flank. Sources do not give many details, but they say that though he was still a youth, he routed the enemy in front of him and was courageous in the melee. Nevertheless, the Antigonids lost the battle, and Pyrrhus managed to escape with Demetrius to Greece. Pyrrhus was then tasked with commanding the remaining Antigonid allies in Greece, while his superior travelled to Thrace in order to make war with Lysimachus. In 298, Demetrius made peace with Ptolemy I, who had solidified his position as the ruler of Egypt. As a part of the peace terms, Pyrrhus was sent to Egypt as a hostage, which was more of a position as an honoured guest than a prisoner in the ancient world. The new arrival impressed the court in Alexandria with his strength and prowess, both in hunting and during military exercises. His years in exile, both with the Illyrians and Demetrius, seem to have made him skillful at ingratiating himself with those he resided with. After a few months, Pyrrhus was permitted to marry Ptolemy's stepdaughter Antigone, tying him closer with the court in Egypt. In 297, Cassander died, and the Egyptian ruler provided Pyrrhus with soldiers and money so that he might reclaim his kingdom. He came to terms with Neoptolemus, and both decided to share royal power. Predictably, both kings immediately began plotting. After a conspiracy by Neoptolemus was uncovered, Pyrrhus invited him to dinner and assassinated his co-ruler, becoming the undisputed king of Epirus for decades to come. Like the other Hellenistic rulers, Pyrrhus would soon attempt to expand his kingdom at the expense of his neighbours, and he would use the Epirot army to do this. Thucydides describes the typical 5th century army of Epirus as a tribal levy, disorganized, brave when things were going their way, but quick to dishearten and flee at any setback. However, it is clear that Epirus was influenced by the reforms in the Macedonian army to its east. Their infantry fought in the close order Sarissa phalanx, and the cavalry fought with lances, similar to Alexander's companions. At the start of his reign, it is probable that this new modern army of Pyrrhus had a total of 20 to 25,000 troops, and was a match for almost any of his contemporaries. In the tumultuous struggle for the throne after the death of the former king, Pyrrhus was drawn into a civil war between Cassander's sons, the eldest Antipater and the youngest Alexander. Their mother, Thessalonike, favoured Alexander and split the kingdom between them. However, Antipater was not satisfied with this and killed their mother, seizing the whole of the country in 294 BC. In return for Stymphaea and Porawaia in Macedon, and Ambracia, Acarnania and Amphilochia in Greece, Pyrrhus agreed to help Alexander. After securing these new territories with garrisons, he conquered the rest of Macedonia and handed it over to Alexander. Lysimachus, who had been petitioned by Antipater to help, advised the two kings to come to terms, and so they did, while Pyrrhus withdrew back to Epirus. This was not the end of it. Demetrius, who had been campaigning against the Spartans, now marched north, and eventually murdered Alexander after a feast. Then he assembled the Macedonian army and proclaimed that he was the rightful claimant to the throne, and that Cassander and his sons were the murderers of Alexander the Great's family, whereas his own house had followed Alexander's legacy and attempted to keep it alive. This won the Macedonians over, and they acclaimed him the new king. By the end of 294 BC, Demetrius controlled a powerful empire, consisting of the entirety of Greece with the exceptions of Sparta, Messenia and Pyrrhus's kingdom, with which he now shared a border. The former master and apprentice would be rivals for years to come. Meanwhile, Pyrrhus's wife Antigone died in childbirth, and he embarked on a series of political marriages which gained him the island of Corcyra. The Greek cities revolted against the Macedonian king twice in 293 BC. Encouraged by this, Pyrrhus invaded the western part of his neighbour's kingdom with around 30,000 troops and exacted tribute from a few cities. Responding almost immediately, Demetrius marched against Pyrrhus with a vastly superior army, and so he retreated into Epirus before the Macedonians could bring them to battle. Before leaving to besiege Thebes, Demetrius left an 11,000-strong garrison under his best general, Pantaucus. While he was back in Epirus, Pyrrhus's wife Lanassa, the daughter of Agathocles of Syracuse, deserted him and offered herself and Corcyra to Demetrius, stating that she could no longer bear sharing her home with Pyrrhus's other barbarian wives. Without any navy to oppose his former comrade, Pyrrhus sat back and allowed Demetrius to take both Corcyra and Leucas. This was just a prelude to his future plans. Being just as restless and ambitious as Pyrrhus, Demetrius now attacked Epirus's Aetolian allies in 289, neutralizing them and leaving Pantaucus to occupy them before marching into Epirus. He marched north through the mountain passes to invade Ambracia, while Pyrrhus, hearing of the invasion, quickly assembled a force to oppose Demetrius and marched south down the coastal road. However, as the two armies were now on different roads, they passed one another by. While the unopposed invader now plundered the Epirot countryside, Pyrrhus encountered the 10,000-strong Macedonian force of Pantaucus, which had been left to garrison Aetolia. The army of Epirus likely numbered around 20,000 soldiers and heavily outnumbered their enemy. It is probable that, due to the veteran nature of the soldiers, Pantaucus' reputation as Demetrius' most competent commander, and the mountainous terrain of Aetolia, the battle was evenly matched despite Pyrrhus' numerical advantage. The Macedonians held firm despite the heavy fighting. During this melee, the two commanders sought one another out, and Pantaucus challenged the Epirot king to individual combat. Pyrrhus, not being one to yield to anyone in daring and prowess, accepted this challenge. After first throwing their spears at one another, the two combatants duelled with swords. Pyrrhus was wounded at first, but then quickly gave Pantaucus 2 wounds in return, one on the thigh and then the deciding wound to the neck. Demetrius' general was then carried away by his bodyguards, and being inspired by their commander's victory, the Epirot phalanx cut their enemy to pieces, killed many in the pursuit, and captured 5,000 prisoners, whom Pyrrhus promptly released. This was Pyrrhus' first victory as a commander, and he had conducted himself in a brilliant manner, both in his generalship of the army and his personal courage in the duel. His army, jubilant with victory, now gave him the title Eagle, a moniker which would remain with Pyrrhus throughout his life and future conquests. The Epirot king, in an act of humility to his soldiers, stated, "Through you, I am an eagle, for how should I not be when I have your arms to sustain me?" In addition, the defeated Macedonians now had a high opinion of Pyrrhus and his skill in arms, a fact that would play a part in the wars to come. Demetrius' theft of his wife and the island of Corcyra embittered Pyrrhus, and when he discovered his foe was seriously ill in the wake of the Epirot victory over Pantaucus, he sent an invading army into Macedonia in late 289. He was initially only attempting to plunder the countryside, but without Demetrius to lead the defense, he met almost no resistance, reaching Aegae before he was repelled. When Demetrius had recovered, he gathered a huge army and intended to reclaim his father's old Asiatic possessions, so made peace with Pyrrhus. Confronted by Demetrius' huge Macedonian army, the other kings, Ptolemy, Seleucus and Lysimachus, formed an alliance in order to cut their old Antigonid foe down to size for a second time. The alliance sent embassies and letters to Pyrrhus in Epirus, advising him of the best time to attack when Demetrius was occupied with the other kings. Pyrrhus may have been hesitant, but to remain neutral would have resulted in no gain. If Demetrius gained victory, he could overwhelm Epirus at any point, and if the allies won and Pyrrhus was not part of the alliance, he would reap none of the spoils. Most importantly, this might give him an opportunity to reconquer part of or all of Macedonia, and so he joined the alliance. In 288 BC, the coalition attacked. Ptolemy sailed from Egypt in the south to attack Demetrius with a huge fleet of ships, while Lysimachus thrust into Upper Macedonia from his lands in Thrace. In response, Demetrius moved northeast with his large army to confront Lysimachus, and at this point, Pyrrhus invaded from the south almost completely unopposed. Back to the north, Lysimachus was defeated in battle by Demetrius, but his army was angry that their commander had allowed Pyrrhus to plunder their lands, and unrest began to spread. After Demetrius marched against Pyrrhus himself, the Epirot king sent agents into the enemy camp to spread propaganda and create chaos. Small groups of Macedonians, who supposedly had begun to admire Pyrrhus and his increasingly favourable reputation, defected, followed by the entire army. Demetrius escaped to the coast. Though Pyrrhus had won a great victory and gained Macedonia for himself, Lysimachus now marched into the kingdom and proclaimed that the victory had been a joint effort. Pyrrhus, not confident in the loyalty of the fickle Macedonians, left the kingdom to Lysimachus and retreated to Epirus. Over the next few years, Demetrius I finally perished, and his holdings were inherited by his son, Antigonus Gonatus. Lysimachus attempted to isolate Pyrrhus, but in 282 he was attacked by Seleucus. At the Battle of Corupedium, Lysimachus was defeated and killed, while Seleucus was murdered shortly after. His murderer, Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, wasted no time after his treacherous act and was declared king by the Macedonian army. The only other claimant to the throne of Macedon was Pyrrhus, but he would soon decide on another course of action to the west. Meanwhile, on the Italian peninsula, the southward expansion of a new power, Rome, was threatening the independent Greek colonies in Magna Graecia. One of these cities, Tarentum, a colony built by the Spartans, was the most powerful, and had provoked the Romans by attacking their ships and humiliating their envoys. Now worried about Rome, the Tarentines, who governed democratically at this point, voted to send an embassy to Epirus asking for assistance in 281 BC. Pyrrhus agreed, but demanded that Tarentum must pay the costs of the war and give him supreme command of the allied forces. To further pressure his western rival into going to Italy so that he could concentrate on the east, Ptolemy the Thunderbolt of Macedon offered Pyrrhus 5,000 more phalangites for the campaign. In early 280 BC, Tarentum sent its fleet to transport Pyrrhus's army to Italy. The force which embarked in Epirus consisted of 20,000 men, mostly Macedonian and Epirot Sarissa pikemen, and possibly some mercenaries, 3,000 cavalry, 2,000 archers, 500 slingers, and 20 war elephants. After landing, the king began to militarize Tarentum and deal with any political enemies there, while the Romans did the same in the cities under their control. Preparing for the coming conflict, consul Publius Valerius Levinus was given command of 4 legions and was ordered to march directly against Tarentum. They wanted to force Pyrrhus into battle before his Greek allies arrived, and raided the countryside while pushing south. In mid-280 BC, their plan succeeded, and, learning that the Romans were bearing down on the Greek city of Heraclea, Pyrrhus marched to meet his new foe for the first time. The invading Roman army consisted of 4 Roman and 4 allied legions, and was drawn up in the traditional manipular fashion. Young Hastati manned the front ranks, more experienced Principes filled in behind them, and veteran Triarii stood in reserve. In total, the Romans had around 40,000 legionnaires. In addition, 2,400 Roman and allied cavalry were placed on the wings. They were commanded by Consul Levinus. Meanwhile, Pyrrhus's initial force of 25,500 infantry had been supplemented by thousands of Magna Graecian infantry, mercenaries, and a few thousand cavalry. In total, the Greek army may have numbered around 31,000 infantry, including his 20,000 heavy phalangites and a few thousand local allies. 5,500 missile troops, including 1,000 Rhodian slingers and Thracian javelinmen, formed Pyrrhus's skirmishing force, while his 4,000 cavalry were drawn from the expert horsemen of Thessaly in Greece, who were famous for their ability to move in a diamond-shaped formation, and were armed with the Xyston, a 12-foot-long two-handed spear, and some light javelins, being able to harass or charge with equal skill. In reserve were the Epirot king's 20 war elephants. In contrast to the typically aggressive Roman plan, Pyrrhus wished to delay any battle for as long as possible until his allies could rally their forces and join him. Shadowing the larger Roman force, he encamped on a plain outside the city near the left bank of the Siris River, hoping to protect the settlement on terrain suitable for his phalanx, while his enemy encamped on the other side of the river a little further upstream. When his army was resting, Pyrrhus and his friend Megacles went scouting to examine the enemy camp. Surprised at the organized nature of the supposedly barbarian camp, the Epirot king stated forebodingly, "These don't look like barbarians to me. We'll see what they can do soon." In order to guard the riverbank, a contingent of light infantry missile troops was sent towards it. This done, Pyrrhus turned to other concerns, thinking he had plenty of time in his strong defensive position. He was about to receive a nasty shock. After a few hours of preparation, Laevinus unexpectedly ordered the entire Roman army of over 40,000 legionnaires to cross the river. The small force of light infantry skirmishers that Pyrrhus had placed on the riverbank pelted the Roman vanguard with missiles and slowed them down a little, but the noise of an entire army crossing the river deafened them, and they were unable to hear what was coming. To their left, the Roman Equite cavalry, who had crossed the river further upstream, smashed into the flank of the defending missile units, who quickly retreated after suffering huge losses. The Roman velites were now coming across, and Pyrrhus, who could not afford to lose his river defence entirely before his infantry was ready, organised his phalanx before charging ahead of them with 3,000 of his best cavalry straight into the Roman light infantry vanguard. This slowed them down and gave the Phalangites a chance to catch up. As they approached the battle line, the Roman hastati crossed the river. They were better armed and armoured than the velites, who pulled back behind the line and instead engaged the cavalry on the wings. In this melee, Pyrrhus was knocked off his horse and almost killed by an enemy, which prompted him to pull back. His friend Megacles now swapped armour with Pyrrhus and donned the king's unusually magnificent armour, riding back into the fray. The Romans were now in trouble. Despite Laevinus's bold crossing of the river, the wall of pikes was now fixed and began to slowly push the doggedly determined Romans with their backs to the river. They fought with tenacity, but had not found a way to hit the phalanx in its flank or rear. Gradually, the Roman army began to melt away under the pressure of the phalanx, but then everything turned. Megacles, armoured in the king's panoply, was slain by a legionary, and the helmet was paraded around the battle line, inspiring the Romans and demoralising the Epirots, who all believed that their king was dead. At this point, the phalanx slowly began to waver, and the Romans pushed them back from the riverbank. The real Pyrrhus, understanding that this was a key moment in the battle, charged up and down his line in an attempt to inform his troops that he was not dead, shoring up their morale. At the same time, the 20 war elephants, which had until now been kept in reserve, were unleashed and hit both of the Roman flanks. While their infantry held firm, even against these monsters most of them had never seen before, the cavalry horses panicked and bolted, retreating through their own infantry and splitting the legion's formation. Even the legions lost their grit and began to run, while Pyrrhus commanded his Thessalian cavalry to chase the routing enemy along the shore and into the shallows of the river. By the end of the battle, 7,000 Romans had been killed and 2,000 captured, while the Epirots had suffered 4,000 casualties, including many of their senior veteran officers. Though Pyrrhus had won his first major battle against Rome, it had been a difficult and grinding slogging match. He would soon learn that despite his own martial prowess, he had truly met his match. Rome, dismissing Pyrrhus's offers of surrender terms, began recruiting a new army, and the Epirot king began to patch up his own, ready for the next battle, which was soon to come. In the wake of the defeat at the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC, Consul Levinus returned to Rome. The Roman recruiting machine intensified greatly, quickly replenishing the heavy losses they had suffered in the previous battle. Meanwhile, Pyrrhus, who still did not yet understand the Roman mindset, sent his friend and advisor Cineas forward to Rome as an envoy with great gifts, which were probably meant as bribes. Pyrrhus himself marched north in the direction of Rome proper, and his army was swelled by the Italian Greeks and Italian allies of Rome, who now viewed him as a hero for defeating their subjugators. In a show of Roman honor, Cineas was sent away without achieving his goal of peace, but he had observed the frightening speed of the Roman levy system. Almost directly after this, a Roman named Fabricius arrived at Pyrrhus's court, with the aim of negotiating the release of the prisoners taken at Heraclea. Pyrrhus tried to bribe him to no avail, and then failed to impress him by frightening him with an elephant. Fabricius was also an extremely honourable but prickly man. When Pyrrhus's treacherous physician offered to poison the king for money, Fabricius instead informed Pyrrhus and stated that he would not dishonour Rome by defeating his enemy by treachery. Greatly admiring this paragon of a man, the Epirot king offered the Roman first place among his companions. Fabricius refused, stating that if he had accepted, the Epirots would soon wish he were king instead of Pyrrhus. After this witty remark, he departed back to Rome with the prisoners, who were released as a gesture of kindness. The Pyrrhic army then continued its northward march and attempted to take Capua. Levinus, who had reached the city before them, prevented Pyrrhus from taking it, so the king pivoted south and attempted to seize Neapolis, and again was repelled. After his failure to take the cities in Campania, Pyrrhus marched on Rome via the Latin Road and stopped just 6 kilometers from the city. After Brennus's assault in 390 BC, the walls of Rome had been strengthened and the city was reported to be impregnable. A strong garrison held the city, and 2 other armies were approaching Pyrrhus swiftly, and so he decided to retreat south to Tarentum rather than besiege the city over winter. With the Romans refusing to make peace, the campaign would continue into 279. Since his victory at Heraclea, the Italian tribes had flocked to his banner. Samnites, Lucanians, Bruttians, and Salentines all sent contingents to join Pyrrhus's army. This year, instead of attacking the enemy capital directly, he would campaign up the Adriatic coast in Apulia, hopefully inducing more of Rome's allies to change sides and securing his supply lines back to Epirus. In spring, he began his advance. Up until this point, the legions had been reluctant to confront Pyrrhus after their prior defeat at Heraclea, but having the important Apulian cities threatened, they were forced to, and marched south to meet the Pyrrhic army near the city of Asculum. Consuls Publius Decius Mus and Publius Sulpicius Severio commanded the double consular army that the Romans had brought, consisting of around 40,000 legionaries and 5,000 cavalry. In addition, they had learned from their previous defeat at the hands of Pyrrhus's elephants, and had constructed roughly 300 anti-elephant wagons, armed with iron tridents and manned by missile troops. Pyrrhus, meanwhile, had around 38,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and 19 elephants. His Macedonian phalangites were ordered to the position of honour on the right wing. To their left were the mercenaries hired from Tarentum and Ambracia. Next to these troops were the Bruttians and Lucanians, Italian allies of the Pyrrhic army. In the centre of the line were the Thesprotians and Caunian tribes of Epirus. Even closer to the left were units of Greek mercenaries, and on the left wing of the infantry line were the Samnites, armed as hoplites. Pyrrhus's flanks were covered by his cavalry, with light troops and elephants behind each wing. Outside of the main battle line, Pyrrhus formed up with 2,000 of his elite guard as a mobile reserve, ready to move wherever they were needed. The Roman army had an excellent defensive position, anchored on the far side of a small and swiftly flowing river. Seeing this, and the uneven ground close to the river that his phalanx currently occupied, Pyrrhus retreated to flatter ground to the rear and allowed the Romans to cross the river. When both sides were on the same side of the river, they made contact. The battle between the Phalangites and legionaries in the centre was inconclusive, while the cavalry on both wings engaged one another. The Pyrrhic horsemen engaged in the Macedonian style, continuously wheeling and charging again, while the Romans reined their horses and fought like infantry. As the cavalry battle intensified, Pyrrhus called his elephants forward, but the Romans sent their wagons in as a response. While this slowed the elephants at first, the light infantry deployed with them killed the wagon crews or the oxen pulling them. Meanwhile in the centre, the Romans were getting the better of the Phalangites on the bad terrain, until the Italian allies of Pyrrhus finally broke under the pressure. The king, sensing the danger, charged with his 2,000 elite cavalry reserve to plug the gap and managed to destroy the Roman front ranks in the area. At this point, 4,000 Roman allies, who had been trying to attack the Pyrrhic army from behind, managed to find and burn the Pyrrhic camp, which was visible to the armies in the field. The Phalangites were demoralized by this loss and began to lose cohesion, being pushed back by the Romans. The situation looked critical, but at this moment the elephants and cavalry on the Pyrrhic wings finally managed to attack the Roman flank, which suffered heavy losses. Sensing another massacre, Rome's commanders withdrew in good order back to their camp. The battle had been another hard contest, but Pyrrhus had gained victory again, at the cost of 3,500 men, while the defeated Romans lost around 6,000. As his camp was destroyed, Pyrrhus lost a few hundred more men due to lack of shelter and provisions in the days after the battle. He surveyed the destruction and corpses all around him and famously stated, "One more victory, and we are undone." This is the origin of the term Pyrrhic victory, triumphs so costly that they are just as bad as defeats, a term which we still use 2,300 years later. After the bloody battle at Asculum, Pyrrhus once again marched back to his base at Tarentum and began to recruit fresh soldiers in order to fill his depleted ranks. As he recovered, 2 embassies arrived, each with a unique opportunity for the Epirot king. One was from Macedon back across the Adriatic, where in 279 BC, Ptolemy the Thunderbolt marched out to meet a Gallic invasion and had been killed after falling from his horse. Macedon was in trouble and needed a king who was a proven warrior. The second envoy was from the Greek cities of Sicily, which were beset by enemies, including the Mamertine mercenaries and, more importantly, the extremely wealthy Carthaginians. Likely tempted by ambitions of invading Sicily as a springboard to conquering Carthage, Pyrrhus opted for the Sicilian option, horrifying his Tarentine allies. In late summer of 278, he departed Italy for Sicily with 8,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, his ships managing to avoid the Carthaginian blockade of the island. Pyrrhus's force landed at the eastern coastal city of Tauromenium, where a local tyrant had already declared his allegiance to the Epirot king. From there, he sailed south to Catana. The citizens welcomed him as a liberator, and the army received 3,000 reinforcements. At this point, he travelled with both his army over land and ships at sea towards Syracuse. The Carthaginian army, which was besieging the city, had no naval support and were caught off guard by Pyrrhus's advance, retreating soon after despite their numerical advantage. After his victory at Syracuse, Pyrrhus was able to gain possession of the 140-ship-strong fleet there, which gave him an advantage over the Carthaginian fleet around the island. Now he moved west and marched on Agrigentum, where the city's tyrant, Soristratus, was also allied to him. It was here that Pyrrhus wintered and gathered his troops together before advancing further west. At the beginning of 278, the Pyrrhic army set off once again. The next city, another Heraclea, had to be stormed, and it was a sign that things were going to get much more difficult as they passed the Halykos River into Carthaginian territory. Despite this, the next major cities to the west, Selinus and Segesta, came over to Pyrrhus without a fight. This would be the last walkover he would enjoy on Sicily. Meanwhile in Macedon, Demetrius' son Antigonus Gonatas stepped up and defeated an 18,000-strong Gallic army at Lysimachia by luring them into attacking his abandoned camp, gathering many treasures, and when they were laden with goods, trapping the Gallic force between his army and his fleet. After this, he took the kingship of Macedonia for himself. While Pyrrhus was now in the west, this was not the last time Antigonus would be heard from. Next, Pyrrhus decided to attack the mountain fortress city of Eryx on the northwest coast of the island. Pyrrhus laid siege to the settlement first with catapults and ballistae, and then with scaling ladders. The sources emphasize that Pyrrhus was first to climb the walls, and fought heroically, pushing many defenders back himself. After a hard-fought siege, the city was taken. To the northeast was Panomus, a port settlement which possessed the finest harbour in Sicily. Pyrrhus quickly stormed it after taking a few outlying fortresses, and then finally turned west once again to Lilybaeum. In his attempt to capture this final holdout of Carthage's power on Sicily, he had to raise intense taxes and levies on the cities that he now ruled. This new harsh conduct caused his Sicilian Greek subjects to view him as a tyrant, and he was no longer welcome. As this happened, Tarentum sent another envoy to their former ally. The Romans had reversed all the gains Pyrrhus had made. Seeing no future on Sicily, he marched back to the eastern city of Masena and sailed back to Italy. The city of Locri in southern Italy had a temple to the goddess Persephone and was well stocked with years of temple offerings. Always in need of funds, Pyrrhus robbed the temple and loaded the contents onto his ships, which were promptly destroyed in a storm. This misfortune had a great effect on the Epirot king, who considered himself cursed. After its retreat from Sicily, the Pyrrhic army finally arrived back to Tarentum in the spring of 275 BC, and Pyrrhus immediately began attempting to rebuild it. Finding troops was seemingly not a problem for the reputable commander, but finding more veteran troops to replace those he had lost in his previous battles was a more difficult matter. The core of the Pyrrhic phalanx were Greeks and the various Balkan tribes, who were in short supply in southern Italy. He had to make do with a weaker militia from Tarentum. Pyrrhus's reputation among the local tribes and Greek city-states had also suffered due to his previous abandonment of them, and so tribes such as the Samnites hardly supported him at all. Once rested and replenished, Pyrrhus and his army marched north to meet the legions for the third time. At that point, there were 2 Roman armies in the field, and feeling confident he could defeat them in detail, Pyrrhus sent a small contingent of his army to Lucania in order to delay the second consular army's approach. He then took around 35,000 of his best remaining soldiers and the main portion of his army to attack the roughly 25,000 strong force of Manius Curius Dentatus, which had encamped on a hill near the town of Beneventum. Again, the Romans had chosen rugged terrain which would disrupt the Pyrrhic phalanx, and had an excellent defensive position. The Epirots could not hope to attack head-on, so Pyrrhus, possibly being influenced by the legendary final stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae, and needing a swift victory, sent 1/4 of the best troops and remaining elephants in his army on a deep flanking maneuver up a forested hillside at night, which would bring them up above and behind the Roman position. Meanwhile, the main force of the army would wait, formed up for battle on the plain below the legionary camp, waiting for the trumpets which would signal that the flanking force had made it. Pyrrhus's flanking contingent set off at dusk and travelled throughout the night, but they got lost in the dark and thickly forested woods. possibly due to the resentment of their Samnite guides, who, itching for revenge, led the Greek force astray. Contingents of soldiers began to wander off in the dark and become hopelessly lost, while others tried to find the path on their own. Confusion in this beleaguered group was total, and it was clear that there would be no coordinated night attack. Eventually, even their torches went out, and they were irreversibly lost. Back down on the plain, the soldiers in the main force were kept awake, becoming more and more tired. As the hours ticked by, it became clear to them that the trumpets would not be sounding that night. Dawn broke, and the Pyrrhic flanking force finally emerged fully visible on the heights behind the Romans, with their element of surprise completely gone. Nevertheless, trumpets sounded and the battle began. The Roman Velites skirmishers charged forward and threw a storm of light javelins at the phalanx, which was already disordered by the terrain, and now began to fray under the pressure. As the Velites rushed between the Roman maniples in retreat, the Hastati now smashed into the tired and hungry Phalangites. Their final reign of Pila, as well as their frontal charge, began to disintegrate Pyrrhus' flanking force on the heights, and he hastily ordered his remaining elephants to charge at the Roman flanks. Unfortunately for him, the Romans had learned well, and shifted the Principes, in addition to the withdrawn Velites, to the wings, with many Pila at the ready, and they unleashed a withering hail of missiles against the elephants, which panicked and bolted, crushing many of their own tightly packed infantry as they did. Seeing that all was lost on the heights, Pyrrhus and a few hundred elite guards began to charge down the hill towards the remainder of his army and attempted to rally them, before positioning himself with the cavalry on the right flank. Turning away from Pyrrhus' now mauled flanking force, the triumphant Roman army began to charge downhill at the main body of the phalanx. As the Romans crashed into the Phalangites with immense momentum, the Pyrrhic left flank quickly caved and began to pull back, followed by the right flank. Again, the now desperate Epirot king attempted to save the situation by sending in his last remaining elephants, and again the Roman skirmishers and javelinmen scattered them. Finally, the battered and exhausted Pyrrhic soldiers could take no more, and Pyrrhus ordered an orderly retreat to prevent his entire army routing. This crushing defeat was the final straw, and Pyrrhus, whose treasury was completely empty, left a strong garrison in Tarentum before returning to his capital at Ambracia with 8,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. Despite his losses in Italy, Pyrrhus still burned with a limitless ambition and immediately began planning his next campaign. Whether because he wished to raise more funds or was angered at Antigonus for not supporting him in Italy, or because he wanted to become the king of Macedon, Pyrrhus attacked his eastern neighbour in 274 BC. The campaign began well, with the Epirots taking many border towns and even having 2,000 Macedonian Phalangites defect to them. After a few weeks, Antigonus marched against the invaders and met Pyrrhus at a narrow gorge near the Aous River. Pyrrhus' veteran phalanx had the best of the initial fighting and drove the Macedonians back, while Antigonus's Galatian mercenary rearguard resisted for a short while, but were then cut to pieces and routed. This left the unengaged Antigonid elephants isolated, and their handlers surrendered both themselves and their animals to Pyrrhus. On the front line of the phalanx clash, the Macedonians were wavering, and the Epirot king decided on a bold course of action. He raised his right arm and called on the Macedonian officers by name to surrender to him. As they had on a number of earlier occasions, the fickle phalanx of Antigonus deserted en masse. The battle was over, and Antigonus fled with a few bodyguards to Thessalonica. Pyrrhus now followed up his victory by overrunning all of Thessaly and most of Upper Macedonia, while Antigonus managed to hang on to some of the coastal cities with his strong navy. Always the tactician and never the strategist, Pyrrhus failed to finish off Antigonus when he had the chance, and he would pay the price. a rejected Spartan royal candidate named Cleonymus appeared at the Epirot court and approached Pyrrhus, proposing a plan to overthrow the Spartan king Areus and place himself on the throne while the king was campaigning in Crete. The opportunity to place his own puppet on one of Sparta's thrones was too tempting, as it would allow the conquest of the remaining Antigonid strongholds in southern Greece. With 25,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry and 24 elephants, Pyrrhus invaded the Peloponnese in 272 BC, crossing the Gulf of Corinth by sea, as the only land route into the area at the Isthmus of Corinth was occupied by Antigonid forces. The Pyrrhic army disembarked and then marched south towards Megalopolis in Arcadia, where he was met by the Spartan ambassador. Here, Pyrrhus lied and professed that he simply wished to attack the forces of Antigonus and to liberate the Greek cities from his rule. He also claimed that he wished to send his sons to Sparta for a military education, and the Spartans believed him, proceeding to reduce their patrols. Pyrrhus then betrayed the Spartans and marched on their city through the friendly territory of Messenia. By keeping to the west of the Taygetos Mountains, he concealed his movements from the Spartans and emerged to the south of Sparta, completely surprising them. Outside of the city, Pyrrhus's 27,000-strong force met Sparta's 15,000 and routed them. As he marched on the city, the Spartan council decided to send their women and children away to safety in Crete. However, when they learned of the decision, the Spartan women vigorously opposed it. One woman, known as Archidamia, came to the council with sword in hand, saying that she had no wish to live on if Sparta perished. Their resolve was strengthened by the courage that their women showed, and they began to construct defensive trenches and stone walls. As they did, however, their women came to them and told the soldiers to rest, as they would need all the strength they could get, and they themselves began to prepare the defences. In the morning, Pyrrhus led a frontal attack on the Spartan trench, but was repelled. His son Ptolemy then led a force of 2,000 Galatian and Epirot infantry around the left side of the trench, but he was ambushed from the rear by 300 men following the Spartan prince Acritatus, and Ptolemy's soldiers were almost all killed, with only a small contingent managing to make it back to the Epirot line. Pyrrhus then attempted several more times to break the Spartan defences, but the trench held firm. The Spartan women continued to assist in the battle, digging further defences and carrying the wounded away to the rear. Nightfall eventually stopped the battle. Irritated at his failure, Pyrrhus retreated and marched on Argos to intervene in a dispute. However, during the withdrawal, his son Ptolemy was killed in a Spartan ambush, and Pyrrhus descended into a black mood. Two politicians, Aristeus and Aristippus, were feuding in Argos. As Aristippus was an ally of Antigonus, it was only natural that Aristeus sought aid from Pyrrhus. As he arrived near the city, Pyrrhus saw that his rival Antigonus had already occupied the heights above the plain, and challenged him to come down onto the plain and fight for the kingdom. Antigonus, who was a much more cautious and less glory-seeking character than Pyrrhus, declined and retreated slightly from the city, as his army was much smaller than that of Pyrrhus. During the night, Pyrrhus's allies within Argos opened one of the gates into the city, and his Galatian mercenaries took possession of the marketplace along with his elephants. The Argives, who learned of the attack, sounded the alarm and rushed to take strongpoints in the city. In addition, they sent messages to Antigonus asking for help. He had not withdrawn far and quickly marched back to his position outside the city, sending a contingent inside in order to assist against Pyrrhus. At the same time, Spartan king Areus came with a force of 1,000 lightly armed Spartans and Cretans. The Argives, along with their new allies, attacked the Galatian mercenaries. However, as the night progressed, the darkness caused both sides to become confused, and so the fighting died down until morning. When the sun rose and illuminated the situation, Pyrrhus was concerned by the numbers of the enemy troops in the city and decided to retreat, but was worried by the narrowness of the gates. He sent a message to his son Helenus to tear down a part of the city wall to allow a quicker withdrawal, but the courier misheard the order due to the noise of fighting. Instead, he delivered an order to march to his father's assistance in the city, and his relief force clashed head-on with his father's retreating force. The largest of Helenus' elephants had also become trapped in the narrow gateway and blocked the retreat. The Epirot army inside the city now began to panic and flee in all directions as the Argives attacked, while Pyrrhus himself turned to his pursuers. One of them was a hastily enrolled poor young man of the city. He managed to wound Pyrrhus slightly with a spear through his breastplate, but was set upon by the king and a duel began. This Argive's mother was said to be watching the battle from the rooftops, and seeing her son confronted by such a lethal foe, threw a roof tile at him in desperation, which knocked him off his horse. Pyrrhus of Epirus, the fiery figure who had battled Romans, Carthaginians, Macedonians and Spartans, was beheaded as he lay injured on the ground. The death of Pyrrhus caused his army to surrender, and in the aftermath, Macedonian hegemony was re-established over Greece. Pyrrhus would be one of the last vestiges of the Alexandrian spirit of a Greek warrior king. But there are always more stories to tell, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.